Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more in the Buddha's words. Yeah, we read the preface and forward last episode. So with that done, let's go into the general introduction to the book. Uncovering the structure of the teaching. Though his teaching is highly systematic, there is no single text that can be ascribed to the Buddha in which he defines the architecture of Dhamma, the scaffolding upon which he has framed his specific expressions of the doctrine. In the course of his long ministry, the Buddha taught the different ways as determined by occasion and circumstances. Sometimes he would enunciate invariable principles that stand at the heart of the teaching. Sometimes he would accept the teaching to accord with the proclivities and the aptitudes of the people who came to him for guidance. Sometimes he would adjust his exposition to fit the situation that required a particular response. But throughout the collections of texts that have come down to us as authorized word of the Buddha, we do not find a single sutta, a single discourse in which the Buddha has drawn together all the elements of his teaching and assigned them to their appropriate place within some comprehensive system. While in a literate culture in which systematic thought is highly prized and the lack of such a text with a unifying function might be viewed as a defect, in an entirely oral culture, as was the culture in which the Buddha lived and moved, the lack of a descriptive key to the Dhamma would hardly be considered significant. Within this culture, neither teacher nor student aimed at conceptual completeness. The teacher did not intend to present a complete system of ideas. This pupils did not aspire to learn a complete system of ideas. That the aim that united them in this process of learning, the process of transmission, was that of practical training, self-transformation, the realization of truth, and unshakable liberation of the mind. This does not mean, however, that the teaching was always expediently adapted to the situation at hand. At times, the Buddha would present more panoramic views of the Dhamma that united many components of a path in a guided or wide-ranging structure. But though there are several discourses that exhibit a broad scope, they still do not embrace all elements of the Dhamma in one overarching scheme. The purpose of the present book is to develop and exemplify such a scheme. I here attempt to provide a comprehensive picture of the Buddha's teaching that incorporates a wide variety of suttas into an organic structure. This structure, I hope, will bring to light the intentional pattern underlying the Buddha's formulation of the Dhamma, and thus provide the reader with the guidelines for understanding early Buddhism as a whole. I have selected the suttas almost entirely from the four major collections, or Nikayas, of the Pali Canon, though I have also included a few texts from the Udana and Itivuttaka, two small books of the fifth collection, the Khuddaka Nikaya. Each chapter opens with its own introduction, in which I explain the basic concepts of early Buddhism that the text exemplify and show how the text give expression to these ideas. I will briefly supply background information about the Nikayas later in this introduction. First, however, I want to outline the scheme that I have devised to organize the suttas. Although my particular use of this scheme may be original, it is not sheer innovation, but is based upon a threefold distinction that the Pali commentaries make among the types of benefits to which the practice of the Dhamma leads. 1. Welfare and happiness visible in this present life. 2. Welfare and happiness pertaining to future lives. And 3. The ultimate good, Nibbana. 3 preliminary chapters are designed to lead up to those that embody this threefold scheme. Chapter 1 is a survey of the human condition, as it is apart from the appearance of the Buddha in the world. Perhaps this was the way human life appeared to Bodhisattva, the future Buddha, as he dwelled in the Tusita heaven, gazing down upon the earth, awaiting the appropriate occasion to descend and take his final birth. We behold a world in which human beings are driven helplessly toward old age and death, in which they are spun around by circumstances so they are oppressed by bodily pain, cast down by failure and misfortune, made anxious and fearful by change and deterioration. It is a world in which people aspire to live in harmony, but to which their untamed emotions repeatedly compel them, against their better judgment, to lock horns in conflicts that escalate into violence and wholesale devastation. Finally, taking the broadest view of all, it is a world in which sentient beings are propelled forward by their own ignorance and craving from one life to the next, wandering blindly through the cycle of rebirths called samsara. Chapter 2 gives an account of the Buddha's descent into this world. He comes as the one person who appears out of the compassion for the world, whose arising in this world is the manifestation of great light. We follow the story of his conception and birth, of his renunciation and quest for enlightenment, and his realization of the Dhamma and of his decision to teach. The chapter ends in his first discourse to the 5 monks, his 5 disciples, in the Deer Park near Varanasi. Chapter 3 is intended to sketch the special features of the Buddha's teachings, and by implication, the attitude with which a prospective student should approach the teaching. The texts tell us that the Dhamma is not a secret or esoteric teaching, but one which shines when taught openly. It does not demand blind faith in authoritarian scriptures, in divine revelations, or infallible dogmas, but invites investigation and appeals to personal experience as the ultimate criterion for determining its validity. The teaching is concerned with the arising and cessation of suffering which can be observed in one's own experience. It does not set up even the Buddha as an unimpeachable authority, but invites us to examine him to determine whether he fully deserves our trust and confidence. Finally, it offers a step-by-step procedure whereby we can put the teachings to the test, and by doing so realize the ultimate truth for ourselves. With chapter 4, we come to the text dealing with the first of the three types of benefit the Buddha's teaching is intended to bring. This is called the welfare and happiness visible in this present life. Dithadhamma hitasukha, the happiness that comes from following ethical norms in one's family relationships, livelihood, and communal activities. Although early Buddhism is often depicted as a radical discipline of renunciation directed to a transcendental goal, the Nikayas reveal the Buddha to have been a compassionate and pragmatic teacher who was intent on promoting a social order in which people can live together peacefully and harmoniously, in accordance with ethical teachings on the duties of children to their parents, on the mutual obligations of husbands and wives, on right livelihood, on the duties of the ruler towards his subjects, and the principles of communal harmony and respect. The second type of benefit to which the Buddha's teaching leads is the subject of chapter 5, called the welfare and happiness pertaining to the future life. Samprayayika hitasaka. This is the happiness achieved by obtaining a fortunate rebirth and success in future lives with one's accumulation of merit. The term merit, punna, refers to the wholesome karma, considered in terms of its capacity to produce favorable results within the round of rebirths. I begin this chapter with a selection of text on the teaching of karma and rebirth. This leads into general text on the idea of merit, followed by the selections on the three principal bases of merit recognized in the Buddha's discourses: giving, dana, moral discipline, sila, and meditation, bhavana. Since meditation figures prominently in the third type of benefit, the kind of meditation emphasized here as a basis for merit is the productive of the most abundant mundane fruits, the four divine abodes, Brahmavida Vihara, particularly the development of loving kindness. Chapter 6 is transitional, intended to prepare the way for the chapters to follow, while demonstrating that the practice of his teaching does indeed conduce to happiness and good fortune within its bounds of mundane life. In order to lead people beyond these bounds, the Buddha exposes the danger of inadequacy in all conditioned existence. He shows the defects in sensual pleasures, the shortcomings of material success, and the inevitability of death, and the impermanence of all conditioned realms of being, to arouse in his disciples an aspiration for the ultimate good, nibbana. The Buddha again and again underscores the perils of samsara, Thus, the chapter comes to a climax with two dramatic texts that dwell on the misery of bondage to the round of repeated birth and death. The following 4 chapters are devoted to the third benefit that is of the Buddha's teaching is intended to bring, the ultimate good, paramatha, the attainment of nibbana. The first of these, chapter 7, gives a general overview of the path of liberation, which is treated analytically through the definitions of the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path, and dynamically through an account of the training of the monk. A long sutta on the graduated path surveys the monastic training from the monk's initial entry upon the life of renunciation to his attainment of arahantship, the final goal. Chapter 8 focuses on the taming of the mind, the major emphasis in the monastic training. I here present texts that discuss the obstacles to mental development, the means of overcoming these obstacles, different methods of meditation, and the states of being attained when the obstacles are overcome and the disciple gains mastery over the mind. In this chapter, I introduce the distinction between samatha and vipassana, serenity and insight, and one leading to samadhi, or concentration, and the other to panna, or wisdom. However, I include texts that treat insight only in terms of the methods used to generate it, not in terms of its actual contents. Chapter 9, titled Shining the Light of Wisdom, deals with the content of insight. For early Buddhism, and indeed for almost all schools of Buddhism, insight or wisdom is the principal instrument of liberation. Thus, in this chapter, I focus on the Buddha's teaching about such topics pivotal to the development of wisdom as right view, the 5 aggregates, the 6 sense bases, the 18 elements, dependent origination, and the 4 noble truths. This chapter ends with a selection of texts on Nibbana, the ultimate goal of wisdom. The final goal is not achieved abruptly, but by passing through a series of stages that transforms an individual from a worldling into an arahant, a liberated one. Thus, chapter 10, the planes of realization, offer a selection of texts on the main stages along the way. I first present the series of stages as a progressive sequence. Then I return to the starting point and examine 3 major milestones within this progression. Stream entry, the stage of the non-returner, and arahantship. I conclude with a selection of suttas on the Buddha, the foremost among the arahants, here spoken under the epithet he used most often when referring to himself, the Tathagata, the origins of the Nikayas. The text I have drawn upon to fill out my scheme are, as I said above, all selected from the Nikayas, the main sutta collections of the Pali Canon. Some words are needed to explain the origin and nature of these sources. The Buddha did not write down any of his teachings, nor were his teachings recorded in writing by his disciples. Indian culture at the time the Buddha lived was still predominantly pre-literate. The Buddha wandered from town to town in the Ganges plain, instructing his monks and nuns, giving sermons to the householders who flocked to hear him speak, answering the questions of curious inquirers, and engaging in discussions with people from all classes of society. The records of his teachings that we have do not come from his own pen or from transcriptions made by those who heard the teaching from him, but from monastic councils held after his parinibbana, his passing away into nibbana, for the purpose of preserving his teaching. It is unlikely that the teachings that derive from these councils reproduce the Buddha's words verbatim. The Buddha must have spoken spontaneously and elaborated upon his themes in countless ways in response to the varied needs of those who sought his guidance. Preserving the oral transmission such a vast and diverse range of material would have bordered on the impossible. To mold the teachings into a format suitable for preservation, the monks responsible for the text would have had to collate and edit them to make them better fit for listening, retention, recitation, memorization, and repetition, the 5 major elements in oral transmission. This process, which may have already been started during the Buddha's lifetime, would have led to a fair degree of simplification and standardization of the material to be preserved. During the Buddha's life, the discourses were classified into 9 categories according to literary genre: Sutta, prose discourses; Gaya, mixed prose and verse; Vyakarana, answers to questions; Gatha, verse; Udana, inspired utterances; Itivuttaka, memorable sayings; Jataka, stories of past births; Abluttadhamma, marvelous qualities; and Vidala, catechism. At some point after his passing, this older system of classification was superseded by a new scheme that ordered the text into larger collections called Nikayas in the Theravada Buddhist tradition, Agamas in the North Indian Buddhist schools. Exactly when the Nikaya Agama scheme became ascendant is not known with certainty, but once it appeared, it almost completely replaced the older system. The Kulavagga, one of the books in the Pali Vinaya Pitaka, gives an account of how the authorized texts were compiled at the first Buddhist council held 3 months after the Buddhist's parinibbana. According to this report, shortly after the Buddha's death, the elder Mahakassapa, the de facto head of the Sangha, selected 500 monks, all arahants or liberated ones, to meet and compile an authoritative version of the teachings. The council took place during the Rains retreat at Rajagaha, modern Rajgir. the capital of Magadha, then the dominant state of Middle India. Mahakassapa first requested the Venerable Upali, the foremost specialist on disciplinary matters, to recite the Vinaya. On the basis of this recitation, the Vinaya Pitaka, the compilation on discipline, was compiled. Mahakassapa then asked the Venerable Ananda to recite the Dhamma, that is, the discourses, and on the basis of the recitation, the Sutta Pitaka, the compilation of discourses, was compiled. The Kulavagga states that when Ananda recited the Sutta Pitaka, the Nikayas had the same contents as they do now, with the suttas arranged in the same sequence as they now appear in the Pali Canon. This narrative doubtlessly records past history through the lens of a later period. The agamas of the Buddhist schools, other than the Theravada, respond to the four main Nikayas, but they classify suttas differently and arrange their contents in a different order from the Pali Nikayas. This selects that if the Nikaya Agama arrangement did arise from the first council, the council had not yet assigned suttas to their definitive places within this scheme. Alternatively, it is possible that the scheme arose at a later time. It could have arisen at some point after the first council, but before the Sangha split into different schools. If it arose during the age of sectarian divisions, it might have been introduced by one school and then been borrowed by others, so that the different schools would assign their texts to different places within the scheme. While the Kulavagga's account of the first council may include legendary material mixed with historical fact, there seems no reason to doubt Ananda's role in the preservation of the discourses. As the Buddha's personal attendant, Ananda had learned the discourses from him and other great disciples, kept them in mind, and taught them to others. During the Buddha's life, he was praised for his retentive capacities and was appointed foremost of those who have learned much. Etadagam Bahusuttanam. Few monks might have had memories that could equal Ananda's, but already during the Buddha's lifetime, individual monks must already have begun to specialize in particular texts. The standardization and simplification of the material would have facilitated memorization. Once the text became classified into the Nikayas or Agamas, the challenges of preserving and transmitting the spiritual heritage were solved by organizing the textual specialists into companies dedicated to specific collections. Different companies within the Sangha could thus focus on memorizing and interpreting different collections, and the community as a whole could avoid placing excessive demands on the memories of individual monks. It is in this way that the teachings would continue to be transmitted for the next 300 to 400 years until they were finally committed to writing. In the centuries following the Buddha's death, the Sangha became divided over disciplinary and doctrinal issues until the 3rd century after the Parinibbana. There were at least 18 schools of sectarian Buddhism. Each sect probably had its own collection of texts regarded more or less as canonical, though it is possible that several closely affiliated sects shared the same collection of authorized texts. While the different Buddhist schools may have organized their collections differently and through different suttas show differences, or through their suttas show differences of detail, the individual suttas were often remarkably similar, sometimes almost identical, and the doctrines and practices they delineate are essentially the same. The doctrinal differences between the schools did not arise from the suttas themselves, but from the interpretations and textual specialists imposed upon them. Such differences hardened after the rival schools formalized their philosophical principles into treatises and commentaries expressive of their distinctive standpoints on doctrinal issues. So far as we can determine, the refined philosophical systems had only minimal impact on the original texts themselves, which the schools seemed disinclined to manipulate to suit their doctrinal agendas. Instead, by means of their commentaries, they endeavored to interpret the suttas in such a way as to draw out ideas that supported their own views. It is not unusual for such interpretations to appear defensive and contrived, apologetic against the words of the original text themselves. So yeah, we'll go ahead and end this episode, this reading there. There's still more of the introduction to go, and then we get into the actual text. So next episode we'll probably finish out the introduction, because I've only made it about halfway through it. But hopefully by chapter 4 we'll be starting into the actual text and stuff, which will be nice. Well, it's got an introduction in itself. So, but it's not near as long, and then we get into the actual writings and text. But, yeah. Need to fix the mouse. It's bouncing around all over the place because it's trying to do stuff, and I'm like, no, stop it, mouse. Anyway, yeah. The author speaks to us about a lot of how the writings and everything came to be, that are the Nikayas, the books that contain the Buddha's teachings. And he also puts forth how he's assigned each chapter together. Because, remember, as the author has pointed out, a lot of his teachings were word of mouth, memorization, recitation. So they weren't written down in the beginning. it was still very, hey, this is what I think. So, even with those with great memory, there's always a chance it's going to be slightly different than what exactly was said. As, again, the author has pointed out, don't expect anything to be verbatim. These were written down later. But, yeah. The way he almost talks about the Buddha, he kind of describes them, it, at least it feels like to me, as if the Buddha is a spiritual, more of a spiritual philosopher than so much a spiritual teacher. But yeah. But with that, we'll go ahead and end this episode there. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.